Okay. Thank you, Al, for inviting me. I appreciate the opportunity to come and speak. Al, when he called me last summer about this, asked me to talk about the impact of climate change on biodiversity in the oceans. I said, well, I'm very comfortable talking about ocean acidification, but biodiversity in the oceans, that's a very broad story, and I don't think I'm the expert. I'm a chemist, after all. I'm not a biologist. So why do you want me to talk about biodiversity? He says, well, you can handle it. So here's my best attempt to handle it. Fortunately, I have some wonderful colleagues in NOAA, and NOAA works very closely with universities, and they have been very gracious in providing me with the slides you'll see here today. So most of what I'm talking about is not my own research. But NOAA has had a responsibility to study these problems over the last 30 years, and there have been a lot of progress in this area. So I picked 3 examples of the impact of climate change on biodiversity. And the first example I picked is temperature and ice edge changes in the Bering Sea. Now, in all these global warming and climate change issues, we have to develop a balance between the natural processes of climate variability and global change. And this is a wonderful example of that because, of course, there's going to be winners and losers in these processes. And if we understand the overall changes that take place between the cycles of variability, we can see what might happen in the future and begin to develop an understanding of the changes in a warming environment and the biological responses. And the Bering Sea is a very good example of that. The second area I want to talk about is in coral bleaching. Here is a case where temperature affects the bleaching of corals. If we understand that, we can see the impacts that might happen in the future. And the third is what Fred talked about earlier, is ocean acidification. It's a brand new issue that's come up in the last 5 or 6 years. It's actually been known for about 30 years. And it has a very severe impact over the long term, and I want to talk about that. So that's what I'm going to try and talk about. So Fred talked about the impacts of the temperature, and we're going to talk about in the first part of the talks the impact of temperature, and we're seeing on globally temperature changes about 0.6 degrees C globally overall, and this is also in the oceans. But in the high latitude regimes, there's an intensification of that impact, and we'll see that in the high Arctic regimes where it affects the ice distributions and the amount of ice available. And in addition to that, since we are seeing a very dramatic change in CO2, that also affects the biological systems in very clear ways. So we go to the Arctic regime and we start looking at what the impact of climate change is on the Arctic. This is a map of the change in the summertime distribution of ice in the Arctic, and we can see from 1979 to 2003 a fairly rapid decrease in the overall distribution of ice in the summertime, about a 20% change in the area. This is larger than the area of Texas, and you can see that the Arctic regime provides the ice for the Bering Sea regime here, and so the linkage between the Arctic and the Bering Sea is quite important. The projections for the future are quite dire, and perhaps by the end of the century there'll be a summertime loss of ice throughout the entire Arctic regime. In the Bering Sea, where I will focus some of my talks, we can see that there has been dramatic changes in the sea ice. This is the March sea ice distribution in the Bering Sea, and the maximum excursion of the sea ice is shown here in the minimum, and see there's been a progression over time of sea ice receding towards the Arctic, and in the summertime we can see that the same effect is occurring in the Chukchi Sea as well. Now, the Bering Sea is a particularly important economic region for the United States because it provides about half of the total global fisheries of the United States in terms of total catch and total weight. And the reason is because it's a very shallow system, and so the flux of carbon from the surface ocean to the shallow regime, supporting this abundant life in the Bering Sea and abundant fisheries, is critically important, and that's linked to the distribution of ice, as I'll show you in a minute. Now, our group in Seattle have been working in the Bering Sea for a number of years, and they have been putting out moorings in the Bering Sea and studying the changes in the surface temperature and the distribution of ice in that region. And what we have seen is very, very dramatic changes in temperature in the Bering Sea, as much as 2 to 3 degrees over the last several years. And you can see that if we look at the distribution of surface temperature, this is for August of this year, we can see the entire North Pacific is significantly warmer than usual, with anomalies on the high of about 2 degrees. And that warm water from the Gulf of Mexico is flowing into the Bering Sea and warming up the Bering Sea in the Arctic regime. Now, if we look at the long time records, we can see that this is a normal process of decadal process that occurs in about a 20 to 30-year time cycle with warm periods and cool periods. And we can see from looking at the distribution of various fish stocks that we can see very dramatic changes in the fish stocks relative to which portion of the cycle we're in. So we have to understand these climate variabilities, natural cycles, relative to climate change. And this is a very difficult issue that has to be resolved. But when we are in these warm cycles as we are now here, we can begin to understand the trends that we might expect to see in the future. You can see, for example, for Central Pacific salmon, they particularly like a little warmer environment and tend to move north from the Bering Sea into the Chukchi Sea in the Arctic region as the water moves north. Another species is pollock. Pollock provides many of the seafood products that we use in the United States, which is in your salads and so forth. And you can see from this slide, pollock is distributed along a 2-degree isoline in the Bering Sea, and they like to be in this 2-degree range. So when the temperatures warmed up over the last several years, they were able to expand their environment and move further to the north. So here is an example where a warming event enhances the environment of a particular species. There are generalists in this case, and they can take advantage of the changing temperatures. Now, a unique situation with respect to the ice edge environment is that near the edge of the ice in the springtime, there's this very enhanced springtime bloom associated with the ice called the ice bloom. And this produces a very rich, nutritious form of phytoplankton, which sinks to the bottom and provides a food source for the benthic community. And they do this before the zooplankton, which usually come a couple months later, can chomp on the phytoplankton and provide a secondary food source to the benthic community. It turns out that this initial input of carbon from the ice edge algae, as you see here, is very nutritious and very important to the benthic populations. And we can see this changes that have taken place over time. This is a plot from this mooring in the Bering Sea, right in the central portion of the Bering Sea right here, of temperature versus depth along this axis. And superimposed on that is the fluorescence, which is an indicator of the distribution of the phytoplankton in the surface waters. And we can see in March and April in 1999 a very striking ice edge bloom, which would be right in this region. And then when it got warmer in 2003, we see that we lost this ice edge bloom, and we now have a normal springtime bloom. So we're losing the ice edge bloom as these ice migrates further and further northward. And this is critically important to the benthic populations. These are clams and bivalves and crabs, various kinds of bottom-dwelling organisms. And you can see that their oxygen utilization rates and their biomass has significantly dropped off as this ice edge phytoplankton moves further and further to the north. Now, in the Bering Sea ecosystem, this is very critical to the larger species in mammals and birds. And I show you two examples here. For example, walruses, which sit on the ice, and then they feed on the bottom-dwelling bottom feeders of the clams and the starfish, and then they come to the surface, sit on the ice, and this is what they eat. And you can see there, if the composition of the seafloor food cycle changes dramatically, as it has been, then there is a significant impact on the higher level organisms. Similarly, the deep diving birds and ducks, which live in near these ice flows and again dive to the benthic communities, are again impacted in much the same way. So you can see the whole Arctic system with the higher level organisms are dependent on how the ice edge migrates further and further north. This is also true for whales and seals, and of course the polar bears that depend on the seals for their survival are also impacted. So the bottom line in this is that we are seeing a very dramatic change in the migration of the ice edge to the north, and all these ecosystems that are dependent on that ice edge have to either adapt by moving further and further northward, or they can't survive. So in my next discussion now, I'm going to take you further south to the tropics, and we'll talk about coral bleaching. Corals are a very important part of the ocean ecosystem because they provide a habitat in essentially what would be a desert. It's like a rainforest in a desert. And this habitat is because they produce these calcium carbonate shell skeletons that provide a place for the other organisms to live and survive. And because they provide a unique situation where they can provide tremendous recycling of nutrients, the productivity is tremendously high in these coral reef systems. 25% of all the diversity of fish life in the world's ocean is dependent on coral reef systems. And it's a very important economic system for the island nations that feed off the fish from the coral reefs. And what happens is that the corals themselves are a combination of a polyp and a zooxanthellae, an algae that live symbiotically together. And the coloration of the beautiful coloration of corals comes from this symbiotic algae. And this algae then gives it a color, provides the food for the coral animal. Then the animal precipitates the calcium carbonate shell to provide the habitat. And all the other fish and other organisms live amongst that habitat. So it's a very unique ecosystem. When the temperature of the water in the summertime gets above perhaps 1 degree above the normal summertime maximum, then the zooxanthellae leaves the coral and moves out into the water. Now the coral can normally handle this if it comes back soon enough, within a couple of weeks or a couple of months. But if the zooxanthellae leaves the coral and stays away long enough, then the coral becomes bleached. It loses its zooxanthellae, and this is why we call this coral bleaching. Now, the scientists have provided an index of this, and this is the degree heating weeks. It's the maximum temperature anomaly for that time period, times the number of weeks that that temperature anomaly exists. This is called degree heating weeks. And two numbers to remember are 8. So if you have a 1 degree temperature anomaly, too warm, times 8 weeks, that would be a degree heating week of 8. And if 8 happens, then there's a 99% that coral bleaching will occur in that environment. If the number gets as high as 13, in other words, 13 weeks of anomalously high temperature, then the corals will begin to die. So here's a normal coral reef system in the Belize in 1995. In 1998, we had that unusual El Nino with really intense heating of the entire equatorial regime. And we can see here the coral bleaching that took place in 1998. In this regime, about 46% of the corals were affected. And when they came back a year later, then they found that the corals had died and macroalgae took over, and so the entire ecosystem changed. from a coral reef ecosystem to a macroalgae ecosystem. This is the kind of impacts that we are seeing with these enormously warm El Niños that occurred for every 4 to 7 years. Now, within the United States, there's a wonderful monitoring problem called Coral Reef Watch, and what they do is they provide satellite temperatures, get real-time monitoring of what the temperature conditions are throughout the world, and retrospective analysis to see what kind of temperatures occurred in the past that would cause coral bleaching. They use this to give out a coral bleaching alert out to the managers of these coral systems. And what they've seen so far that over the past 2 decades, we have lost about somewhere in the neighborhood of 20% of the coral reef systems have died due to these increasing temperatures in the tropical regimes. Now, what they can do is they can send out alerts to the local managers, and they do this on a regular basis, so the managers can do something about it, which they try to do. And more importantly, they can show areas where coral bleaching has occurred that the managers don't even know that their area is under attack. And this is a perfect example of this in 2002, where they identified a coral bleaching area. Here, this line shows the degree heating weeks in color, and colors of yellows are about 8 or 9 degree heating weeks up to a value of 12. And here's an Easter Island patch where they've seen that, and sure enough, this was the impact that the local folks didn't even know about occurring. So we have a way of looking at these issues on a global distribution. And the third area I want to talk about is a new area. It's called ocean acidification. And all these calcium carbonate species that Fred was talking about are very sensitive to changes in carbon chemistry. These are marine planktonic species that provide the primary food source, marine algae, coccolithophorids, and they're a very important part of marine plankton, coral reefs, and also marine zooplankton such as pteropods and forams, all form these calcium carbonate shells in order to exist. And they're very, very sensitive to changes in chemistry. Now, here's a different representation of what Fred was talking about, of what the future holds for us in terms of, this is the ISPC 92A business as usual scenario, taken out to a level about 2,000 parts per million. We're presently at the present day level right here, and you can see by the end of the century, we'll be somewhere between 2 and 3 times the pre-industrial level, right around here. And you can see then that we are already feeling an increase in the dissolved carbon in the water column. Myself and many of my colleagues have spent most of their careers measuring that increase, and it's about 1.2 micromoles per kilogram per year. From the pre-industrial period, that represents about a 65 to 75 micromole increase. And when that CO2 reacts with seawater, as Fred explained to us, that it dissociates to form the hydrogen ion, and this hydrogen ion, it then provides the acidity, and this is why it's an ocean acidification process. And that hydrogen ion also reacts with a carbonate species to form bicarbonate. So the process of ocean acidification decreases the carbonate ion concentration, as shown along here. So you see a decrease in the pH, a decrease in the carbonate ion, but an increase in total CO2 and an increase in the bicarbonate species. Now, it's the carbonate ion species which is critical to the formation of the calcium carbonate shells. So as you decrease that carbonate ion species, it's more and more difficult for them to calcify, and so their calcification rate drops. You get to a certain level called the degree of saturation level, which is indicated here, and these species, the shells begin to dissolve. So what we are looking for in the ocean is where the saturation level exists right now. Now, this is a huge plot. Nobody likes me to show this plot because there's all these numbers. I want to point your attention to where we are now, present day, CO2, 380 parts per million. We've already changed the composition of seawater in terms of its carbonate ion concentration by about 16%. And we've changed the pH of seawater by about 0.1 pH units. And we've changed the saturation state downward by about 16%. So mankind has already affected the chemistry of the ocean. By the time we get to the end of this century, somewhere between 2x and 3x CO2, the pH, the hydrogen ion concentration will have increased by 151%. The carbonate ion concentration will have decreased by 50%. Half the carbonate ion will be gone. And the saturation rate has dramatically dropped in the oceans. So what does that mean in terms of the biodiversity of the organisms? Here is an experiment. This is called a mesocosm experiment. It's done by Ulf Ribesel in Norway. And what he did is he developed these bags, and he did everything in triplet. And in the first bag, he had the atmosphere at 190, the level that would be the pre-industrial level for CO2. Second bag is the present day level for CO2. And the third bag is what we might expect to see at the end of the century. We introduce the CO2 at the atmosphere, allow it to mix with the surface ocean, and see how the biology changes over time. And this is the results of his experiment. These are Emiliani huxi, these are the marine coccolithophores. And we can see that at a doubling of CO2, the coccolithophores are changing their structure. They're not as tight a structure, and the calcification rates are dropping for as much as 45%. In fact, you can see in some species, the whole coccolithophore structures are becoming malformed. Some of the most recent experiments by Vicky Fraby, from my colleague from Cal State San Marcos, has shown that many species just no longer form their calcium carbonate shells as a response to these levels of CO2. Now, Dr. Vicky Fraby has been on several cruises with us. Her expertise is also in marine pteropods. These are marine snails. They're usually about a few tenths of a millimeters to about 2 or 3 centimeters in length. And they provide a major food source for marine fisheries, particularly salmon and whales. And they are swimming in the oceans. And here's an experiment that she did where she took live pteropods, subjected them to high levels of CO2, and while they're still living, the shells were beginning to dissolve within 48 hours of being in contact in an aquarium type of environment. So if you look at what research has been done for the various species of calcifying organisms such as coccolithophores, forams, calcareous algae, and coral reefs, the data suggests exactly the same for every different species, that as you increase the CO2 and decrease the carbonate ion, the impact seems to occur for all species of calcifying organisms. So what we did with that information is we provided a plot of the saturation conditions where the coral reef systems are in a very optimal condition for their development. And so we plotted on here the distribution of all the coral reefs throughout the world. And this is work that I did with my colleague Jim Orr from the University of Paris. And we also plotted on here the deep water corals. These are the newly discovered deep water corals that live at deep water depths somewhere between 100 and 1,000 meters. And we plotted those distributions as well. And you can see that in most cases, we're in a situation where it's fairly optimal for their development. This was the pre-industrial condition. Now we go to the present day condition, and you can see the impact of the CO2 is now impacting at high northern and southern latitudes, so that the deep water corals are being affected now. But the present day coral systems, with a few exceptions, are at least in marginal to satisfactory conditions. If we extend this out into the future using the business as usual scenarios to 2050, we see now that all the coral reef systems are now in a low to marginal condition, and the high latitude systems are in stress. And if we take it out to the end of the century, we see the impact is the entire world ocean coral reef systems are severely impacted. The work that has been done in these mesocosms has shown very clearly that it's a linear relationship between the rate of calcification, the rate of formation of the shelves, and the carbonate ion concentration. As you decrease the carbonate ion concentration, they clearly decrease the rate of calcification, the rate they can form this skeletal material. You get down to a level of about 100 micromoles, and they can no longer secrete their calcium carbonate shells. Here's where the pre-industrial condition is. You can see we've come along this line almost 50% already. If you look at all the data in the literature here for all the different species that we have studied thus far, you can see there is a range of impacts, but they all show a declining impact, declining calcification rate in every species we've looked at thus far. So in conclusion, I would say then is that we need to understand the temporal changes of the physical environment and understand the biological responses. Again, I want to say there are winners and there are losers. So the question is how much these changes will impact the global ecosystems, how much do they affect the economic systems of mankind that depend on these organisms for survival, and how the overall system will work. Secondly, I think it's really important to understand that in the Arctic environment, there is a very tight connection between ice and the ecosystems. And so understanding the changes in the ice structure is critical to understanding these ecosystems, in particular the relationship between these phytoplankton and the benthic environment and the mammals that are dependent on them. And finally, I think it's really important to begin to develop experimental studies in an open system over longer time scales. We don't really know much about how organisms may be able to adapt to these kinds of changing systems. We study these in the laboratory over a couple of years. We don't know what the evolutionary process is by which we can expect to see long-term change. And this is a very important issue for scientists in the future. But it may be that it's very difficult that under the time scales that we're projecting on these organisms of dramatic changes over the next 100 years, that they won't have the opportunity to adapt to these changing conditions. And I'll leave you with one final thought. And this is similar to what Fred was saying, what the future generation would say about the era we are currently living in and the choices that we make now that affect the world as we know it in the future. Thank you.
Boy, that's frightening. Are there questions? Or are you all too frightened to ask? Yes.
I just had a question about the acidification of the ocean. What does it have an effect on acid rains as well and runoff and everything like that? Does it end up running a cycle and affecting the land?
Can you repeat the question, Dick? No, I'm asking him, so everybody.
I think she's asking the question that often comes up is, if this process is occurring in the oceans, do we expect the same process to occur on land and on lakes and affecting our lake systems in much the same manner? And the answer is absolutely yes. The problem is that this has not been a well-studied issue, particularly in lakes, and so you haven't seen much discussion of that. This, as I said, in terms of the scientific community, this has been known for 30 years, but only amongst a few scientists. It's now becoming well aware of in the scientific community over the last 5 years. It hasn't gotten to the point where we had a lot of studies in the limnological systems.
So the Great Lakes are not being looked at? I mean, at least the Great Lakes?
The Great Lakes are very, very sensitive to these kinds of changes, and it's different for different lakes. Lake Superior, which is not well buffered, for example, will be very, very sensitive. Lake Erie, which is very well buffered, will be less sensitive. So it's different for each kind of lakes, and it depends on the geological basin that they are dependent on.
Are there other questions from the audience? Bill?
Can you talk your Bering Sea slide showing the temperature variations? Can you put that up again? like the low temperatures got higher, but the high temperatures didn't get higher. I was wondering if you could explain that.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, the question is, what are we seeing in terms of the temperature changes? And I am certainly not an expert in this, so bear with me on what I do and don't know, because this is not my field. What we see is that the higher temperatures, these would be the summertime maximum temperatures here, started out at about 4 to 5 degrees, and we see that they have recently increased to as high as 7 or 8 degrees. The wintertime temperatures here, which are less than 0 in some cases, are now up as high as 3 degrees. Part of the reason for the change in the wintertime temperatures is due to the loss of the ice. The low temperatures in the bottom and in the wintertime are due to the interactions and the impact with the ice. When the ice has moved away, you no longer have that cooling effect of the ice, and so you are seeing the higher temperatures. A second impact of this is the flow regime. Remember, it comes from the Gulf of Alaska through the Aleutian Islands, as we've seen here, and so we're seeing the impact of the warming of the Pacific, its impact on the Bering Sea. Two different effects that are both important.
Okay, thank you.